In this video, we engage the topic of Pauline ethics following the method laid out by Dr. Richard B. Hayes in the Moral Vision of the New Testament that I overviewed in the last video. What we're going to do here is look at some basics of Pauline ethics, some of the main ideas that serve as foundations for how we do ethics with respect to Pauline literature. And then we're going to look at one particularly thorny passage in Paul's letter to the Romans, namely Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, which, as we shall see, has been used throughout world history and particularly American history in a variety of different ways, oftentimes used to justify oppressive action on behalf of those who are already in authority. With respect to Pauline ethics in the letter of Romans in particular, it's often said that the Apostle Paul moves from the indicative to the imperative. That is to say, Paul makes his statements of facts. He indicates things before he offers imperatives, that is, commands. And we can see this sort of mirrored in the structure of Romans itself. And in chapters 1 through 11 of Romans, Paul is really laying out the foundations of his gospel, especially in chapters 1 through 8, and then engaging with respect to the question of Israel in chapters 9 through 11. So he's laying out those foundational principles about what he believes before moving to make more specific commands about how individuals and communities ought to live on the basis of those indicative statements. So Romans 12 through 16 contains far more commands, direct commands of how people ought to act and behave, those appearing largely in Romans 12 through 16 and appearing minimally in Romans 1 through 11. So with respect to some sort of key themes and ideas, the sort of foundations for how Paul thinks about ethics and how we ought to approach ethics with respect to Pauline literature, it's important to keep in mind that Paul understands a new age, something apocalyptic to have happened. Something new has been revealed in the life, death, ministry, and resurrection of Jesus. And Jesus himself serves as the central example, particularly Jesus's resurrection, or particularly Jesus' suffering, crucifixion, and then his resurrection serves as an example for individuals and communities for how they ought to live. They ought to not look to their own interests first, but ought to look to the interests of others, laying down their own lives, laying down their own interests in service of the greater community. And so that's the third bit here, is that Paul always in his letters is thinking about how communities ought to operate with one another, that how individuals sort of live their lives, what they do is going to affect the community at large. And so Paul is always thinking with respect to using the example of Christ as a way to get along in community. And then those communities as a whole are also looking to this idea of cruciformity, of laying down the community's own interests for the greater good of the larger Jesus movement, of Paul's gospel message and Christianity spreading and getting along in the new world that has been brought about by the death and resurrection of Jesus. When it comes to Pauline ethics, Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, has served as a sort of lightning rod for controversy throughout world history, but especially within American history. Because Paul uses imperative commands here, it seems like there might be a simple application of Romans chapter 13. And so what we'll see, and I'm going to give us 3 examples here, all from American history. We could draw many others from world history, about how Romans 13 has been sort of this lightning rod of debate, but particularly has been utilized by those used by oppressors sort of in oppressive situations. Because we have such blatant commands here about obeying the governing authorities, it seems as though there might be an easy application that in any situation governing authorities must be heeded. They must be one must sort of not resist that governing authority. And so the first example I want to give us is with respect to the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War. Those in America who were loyal to Britain would claim Romans 13 specifically chapters 1 through 7, as on their side, that there was sort of biblical justification for being loyal to the British. That is to say that they emphasize this bit on authorities existing and having being instituted by God. So therefore, resisting authority in revolution is then seen as resisting God's self. The revolutionaries are going to emphasize sort of a different part of Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, that rulers are meant to be not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. So the revolutionaries are going to say, we are acting rightly, and the rulers that are now a terror to us must thus necessarily not actually be sort of proper authorities that are instituted by God, as Romans 13 would have it. Another flashpoint for Romans chapter 13 was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Here, supporters of the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that fugitive slaves, even if they had fled to the north, had to be returned to their masters. So these anti-abolitionists, those who were opposed to the abolition of slavery, would say that every person needs to be subject to the governing authority. So because there was an act, because there was official government word about what persons ought to do with respect to runaway slaves, that supporters of the Fugitive Slave Act and those who were anti-abolitionists would suggest that because this act was enacted by the governing authority, that every person must be subject to that governing authority and must not harbor fugitive slaves. On the other hand, abolitionists are going to emphasize this, particularly the last point in this quotation from Romans chapter 13. Whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. So those who, abolitionists who would resist the Fugitive Slave Act would say, if I am resisting what God has appointed, if I am resisting the authorities, I will incur judgment. I leave it up to God for my judgment in this particular situation. And then most recently, in the year 2018, when children were being separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border, Attorney General Jeff Sessions made news for claiming Romans 13 as sort of in support of this act of separating children from their parents at the border. And he says, I would cite to you the Apostle Paul and his clear and wise command in Romans 13 to obey the laws of the government because God has ordained them for the purpose of order. So in all three of these different cases, we have sort of oppressive situations wherein the oppressors are utilizing Romans chapter 13 to uphold their particular position, which most of us nowadays would say is probably a morally wrong or maybe even morally abhorrent position. When it comes to New Testament ethics, we are not left only to proof texting. In the last video, we outlined this method for engaging New Testament ethics with respect to particular passages. And what we're going to do in the remainder of this video is go through this method with respect to Romans chapter 13. And so that we might get sort of a little bit more depth to our ethical engagement with Romans chapter 13 and not use it as, and not suggest that it is a proof text that simply means that one has to obey governing authorities in all instances, in all times, in whatever context one finds themselves. So the first step in this method is to read the text carefully. That is to engage it on its own. That is to engage the world of the text closely and specifically, but also to look at the text within its larger literary context. So when we look at the larger literary context of Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, we find some other things going on in the larger context, particular phrases about overcoming evil with good, coming in the context following verse 7, and then owing no one to anything except to love one another. And so what we find is that when we put it in the larger context, sort of the application actually gets a little bit more mixed here. And earlier in this semester, we used Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7 to engage the world of the text. Remember, when we do this, when we go through this process of engaging the world of the text, one of the things that we ought to do is look at our passage and engage what's going on before and what's going on after. So what we found with respect to the previous context of Romans is that in Romans chapter 12, Paul begins to instruct his audience about how to be living sacrifices, how to live that cruciform lifestyle that we talked about at the beginning of this video, and to inform his audience what kinds of actions constitute their spiritual worship. Many of Paul's commands in this section have to do with living rightly in community. So living with respect to this cruciform idea, living through this cruciform lens for the sake of community. So immediately before Romans 13, verse 1, Paul writes that persons should not avenge themselves for wrongdoing and should respond to evil with good. And then following Romans 13, 1 through 7, beginning in verse 8, Paul continues his economic language that began in verse 7. And he states that the only debt one should have is to love. And he continues in Romans 13, verses 8 through 10, to extol the importance of love before reminding the audience that the world has changed, that apocalyptic bit, and salvation is near. So when we've set Romans 13, 1 through 7 into this context, we find that it's sandwiched between a command to overcome evil with good. So perhaps Paul is here thinking about the evils of oppressive structures, political structures, and his statements following that acting in love is a way to fulfill debts and commandments. The commands in Romans 13, 1 through 7 to be subject to authorities and pay taxes can be read as ways to overcome institutionalized injustice and act lovingly in an exploitative situation. And of course, this would be very different than sort of just an unnuanced application of those verses where governing authorities are heeded no matter what the situation is. So sort of in this interpretation, looking at the context, what has become sort of utmost importance in our application is to see that Paul is actually encouraging a way to overcome injustice rather than to be complicit within or for. So when we engage the text carefully, we're not only paying attention to the literary context, but also looking at the historical context, thinking about what is going on with respect to the author of the text, namely Paul, and thinking about what is going on within Paul's specific community, what's going on at Rome. So a note here is that it's important to remember that Paul himself was persecuted, that he experienced persecution throughout his ministry by doing exactly what he says in Romans 13, 1 through 7, by being subject to the governing authorities. And that was a way for Paul, in a way, to sort of live out that cruciform principle. And so the other historical bit that's important to think about with respect to Paul and empire, Paul and political institutions, is that Paul uses deeply theopolitical language, that much of the language that Paul uses throughout the letters have political resonances within the Roman Empire. And in some ways, they seem to be somewhat subversive to what the Roman Empire would claim as sort of the best way to go about life, or the truths about the Roman Empire. So what we're going to do is go briefly through several different terms that we would call theopolitical in Paul's vocabulary. The first one being the good news. So while we have been approaching the gospel in this class as sort of outlining Paul's take on how Jews and Gentiles can worship the Jewish God together, gospel in the Roman context also has this very political sense that is the good news, the oral proclamation, a runner coming back and telling the news of a victory in battle, or the fact of a future emperor's birth. The word Lord itself has several different connotations, one being master, as in slave and master, but also the word Lord, kurios in Greek, is the same word used for ruler or emperor, that the emperor is the Lord of all. So to say that Jesus is Lord is to say that Jesus is a different emperor than is the Roman emperor. With respect to savior or salvation, these are terms often used with respect to political engagement, that the emperor is the political savior, ushering in a kingdom or an empire or a rule that is characterized by things like peace, which we'll get to in just a second here. But faith, the term faith, pistis in Greek, is we often think of it as sort of a cognitive assent, a certain belief that we think in our heads or know to be true. But it has a much fuller and wider connotation in Paul's context, meaning something like the loyalty of citizens when it comes to the Roman Empire. And even in Paul's language itself, it's not simply about what one thinks, but it's about what one does. We might translate this word faith or pistis as something like allegiance or loyalty. When Paul speaks of peace, this echoes aspects of the term in with respect to the Roman Empire as a cessation of conflict, a time when there is not conflict within the Roman Empire. There's not civil war within the Roman Empire. And there's this period of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, where people are flourishing and doing well. There is not a lot of military conflict, and people are living in wealth and security. When Paul talks about freedom, this has resonances with political and imperial autonomy, not living under the yoke of another foreign oppressor. When he uses terms like justice, and righteousness, this has sort of echoes of the Roman court system, Roman court justice, wherein one goes to plead one's case in court and get justice with respect to a conflict between two people. When Paul talks about churches or assemblies, these are the same words that are used for sort of self-interest groups or different gatherings of citizens around a particular interest or an occupation. We might think of these sort of as clubs, and these clubs have political resonances. The different clubs are going to support different political figures. And then lastly, this idea of the second coming, or the parousia, is we think of it as the coming of Jesus, coming from heaven of Jesus, or something like this. But in the Roman context, this is the word that is used for the imperial visit. When someone is coming to visit a particular city, they would speak of their coming, or their parousia. So all of that's to say that there's a little bit more going on with respect to the literary context and the historical context of Romans chapter 13, that Paul is using politically freighted terminology throughout the letters, and he seems to be doing something a little bit more complex with Romans 13 verses 1 through 7 when we set it in its larger literary context. The next thing to do when we are thinking about New Testament ethics and thinking about particular texts is to think about the issue that text addresses within its canonical context. That is, look at what other New Testament and also Old Testament passages say or suggest or reveal about the similar or the same topic. So with respect to sort of obeying governing authorities, or how to think about the political structures that are above us, we find a couple of different and perhaps even competing things that are said in the New Testament. So Mark chapter 12 verse 14, Matthew 22:17, and Luke 20:24. These are all parallel passages. They occur in all three of the synoptic gospels. They're going to say, give to the emperor, and this is Jesus speaking, give to the emperor the things that are the emperor, and to God the things that are God. So in this particular statement, you sort of have two different entities. One, you just give to the emperor to what is the emperor's, because it doesn't matter, because this is the earthly world. There's sort of a separation between what's going on in this world and giving to God what belongs to God. So it's sort of a dichotomous approach to how to engage the politics of empire with respect to that saying in the synoptic gospels. In First Peter, we have a statement that sounds somewhat similar to Romans chapter 13, where the author of First Peter says, for the Lord's sake, accept the authority of every human institution, whether of the emperor as supreme, or of governors as sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to praise those who do right. Of course, if we look to the context of First Peter chapter 2, we might complexify what's going on here, but on the face of it, this sort of sounds like a similar thing with respect to Romans chapter 13, to accept human authority. And then a very different take in Revelation chapter 17, verse 5, where John is addressing this is the whore of Babylon. And the whore of Babylon is meant to represent the Roman Empire. It is a not so veiled symbol or allusion to the Roman Empire as a whole. And Revelation 17 says, and on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abomination. So Revelation does not think so highly about the Roman Empire. So it's sort of a mixed bag of different sort of approaches to imperial engagement within the New Testament itself. And of course, we could add other New Testament texts here to the three that we have given. So our next step, based on how we have read the text and based on how we've looked at other canonical texts addressing similar issues, is to start to imaginatively relate the text's moral vision to our own context. And imaginatively is a key adverb here, to think about different kinds of ways, using our sort of ethical and interpretive imaginations to relate the text and the things that we have learned about the text to what we find in our own day and age. So the first thing I say here is that the text, this particular text, Romans 13, 1 through 7, doesn't allow for the formulation of a hard and fast rule about Christians' relationship to the state. I think the literary context and Paul's historical context, sort of the way Paul uses some politically subversive language elsewhere, suggests that we don't simply always have this sort of top-down relationship to the state, where the state is always in all cases thought of as the authority not to be questioned. At the same time, however, the text does seem to suggest a sort of paradigm or principle for seeking the good and recognizing one's most important allegiances. So even within the larger context of Romans 13, 1 through 7, sort of the fact of being subject to the authorities does something else. So there's a way in which we do have a paradigm or principle at work here. And the paradigm or principle is to recognize one's most important allegiances and to try to live in such a way, to try to be subject to authorities in such a way that that those allegiances are still held, while also not sort of not stirring the pot, as it were. And so our last step here is to actually live out the principles that we extract from the text itself. And of course, this is a contextual endeavor. It varies from person to person and community to community. But what I suggest here, given our analysis of Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, is that our initial posture should be one of respect for authorities. And this seems to be mirrored in other New Testament texts as well. And that we are meant to not instigate trouble for trouble's sake, and that we are to seek to overcome evil with love. And I think this is the most important part with respect to placing the text in its context. When we look at the literary context, is that we should not allow this initial posture of respect for authorities to overcome or to overshadow overcoming evil with love. That for Paul, that last bit, sort of overcoming evil with love by living in cruciformity and living in community, is going to be more important than that initial posture. That Paul can sort of hold both of these things in mind while not suggesting only one course of action for all time and in all situations.